State testing protocol is absolute. No disruptions, no exceptions. But when my advanced prosthetic arm started to self-destruct, smoking and crushing itself in the middle of an exam, my teacher faced a choice. He could break the rules to help me, or enforce them. He chose the rules, and with a horrifying snarl, he grabbed my arm and tore it from my body. The atmosphere in the testing room was suffocating, a palpable silence punctuated only by the nervous scratch of graphite on paper and the droning hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. It was the kind of quiet that feels louder than noise, pressing in on you, amplifying every frantic heartbeat. I was immersed in that silence, navigating the labyrinthine questions of the state proficiency exam, when a completely alien sound breached the stillness. It wasn't a cough or a dropped pencil. It was a high-frequency whine, an electronic squeal of distress that seemed to emanate from my own body. My gaze shot down on my right hand, where my myoelectroprosthetic was gripping my pencil. To my horror, the articulated digits, marvels of modern engineering, began to constrict. It was an unnatural, spasmodic contraction, curling inward with a sickening slowness that was entirely independent of my will. The pencil, caught in the inexorable pressure, snapped with a sharp report, its two halves clattering onto my test booklet. "Mr. Rogers," I managed to say, my voice a strangled whisper. The whine from the internal motors was escalating, climbing the auditory scale into a shrill, piercing shriek. Something seriously wrong with my prosthetic. Mr. Rogers, a man for whom rules were not guidelines but gospel, didn't even lift his eyes from the clipboard he clutched like a sacred text. His voice was a monotone blade, sharp and devoid of warmth. State testing protocol is unequivocal. There will be no disruptions. There are no exceptions. His words were a brick wall. But this wasn't a disruption. It was a system failure, a terrifying breakdown happening on my own body. The mechanical fingers were now grinding into the synthetic palm, the force building to a critical level, far exceeding its design specifications. A deep, resonant ache began to throb in my forearm, rapidly escalating into a series of sharp, stabbing jolts of pain. "This is a legitimate medical emergency," I insisted, my voice trembling with a mixture of pain and rising panic. "The safety overrides are failing." He finally looked up, and his eyes were not filled with concern, but with a cold, cynical suspicion. A contemptuous smirk curled the corner of his lip. "How remarkably convenient," he drawled, his tone dripping with acidic sarcasm. "Your prosthetic device just so happens to experience a catastrophic failure during the single most important examination of your high school career." As if on cue, a loud percussive crack echoed from my hand. I watched, my blood turning to ice, as a structural joint in the thumb, forged from high-tensile polymer, fractured and split apart. "It is literally breaking itself," I said, the words barely audible over the sound of my own hammering heart. Mr. Rogers remained a statue of indifference. "In that case, perhaps you should have exercised greater care with your equipment." The prosthetic was engineered to mimic the grip of a human hand, a tool of incredible nuance and precision. But now, it was a medieval torture device, a vice tightening with inhuman, remorseless strength. The pain was becoming a blinding, white-hot nova, a radiating agony that shot from my wrist to my shoulder. "Please, I have to disconnect it," I begged, my eyes fixed on the small, recessed emergency release button near the base of the unit. "There's a manual override." His response was as swift as it was cruel. "If you make any attempt to interact with that device, you will be given an automatic failing grade for this exam. No electronic devices are permitted during the state test." Destiny, the girl in the adjacent seat, leaned toward me, her face a pale mask of alarm. "Is that smoke?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath of sound. "Is that smoke coming from your arm?" I followed her terrified gaze downward. My stomach plummeted. A thin, greasy tendril of gray smoke was uncoiling from the wrist joint, twisting into the stale air. The motors, locked in a self-destructive feedback loop, were overheating to the point of combustion. A sharp, chemical stench, the smell of burning plastic and fried circuits, assaulted my nostrils. A searing heat began to blossom up my forearm as the internal metal components grew hotter and hotter, becoming a branding iron against my skin. "Mr. Rogers, it is literally on fire," I shouted, my voice cracking under the strain. He cast a bored, dismissive glance at the large clock on the wall. "Refrain from being dramatic. There are only 17 minutes left." At that moment, the hand convulsed with a violent mechanical spasm. It jerked open, all 5 fingers shooting out ramrod straight, before slamming back into a fist with such concussive force that my hand smashed down onto the desk, the impact cracking the solid oak surface like a gunshot. A collective gasp swept through the room. Then, the rotational motors engaged, and a new, even more profound agony enveloped me. It felt as if a powerful man had seized my arm and was attempting to wrench it from its socket. From the back of the room, Willie, a kid who rarely spoke above a whisper, shot to his feet. "Oh my God, we have to get him some help right now. Something terrible is about to happen," he yelled, his voice resonating with pure, unadulterated panic. "Silence," Mr. Rogers roared, his face contorting into a mask of purple fury. "The next individual who utters a single word will be summarily expelled from this school district." The threat, brutal and absolute, descended upon the room, choking off any further outcry. But the fear was now a living entity in the room. I could see it in the wide, horrified eyes of my classmates. 2 rows away, Jane was fumbling with her phone beneath her desk, her thumbs a blur of frantic motion. "I'm calling my mom." I heard her whisper to her neighbor. "She's an ER nurse." Like a predator sensing weakness, Mr. Rogers's eyes locked onto her. He stormed toward her desk, his hand outstretched. The phone. Now, my own left hand, my good hand, was shaking uncontrollably as I fumbled for the emergency release. My fingers felt clumsy and useless, unable to find purchase on the small, smooth button. The prosthetic was now rotating back and forth in a violent, chaotic arc, spinning far beyond its mechanical limits, tearing and grinding at the point where the titanium implant integrated with the bone of my forearm. A horrifying, warm slickness began to coat my skin. I risked a glance down and saw the visceral crimson of my own blood, dripping from my elbow and forming a pooling, macabre stain on my test paper. "Somebody call 911. Destiny shrieked, tears carving paths down her cheeks as she leaped from her chair and made a desperate dash for the classroom door. Mr. Rogers, with a surprising burst of speed, intercepted her, physically blocking her path. "You will sit down immediately," he thundered, "or you will be suspended for the rest of the academic year. He is bleeding out. He needs a doctor," she screamed directly into his impassive face. "All of you will put your phones away this instant," he commanded, his voice reaching a hysterical pitch. Violations of state testing security protocols are a prosecutable offense. A wave of open rebellion surged through the room. 3 more students stood up in unison. Josh, the school's star quarterback, a local hero who had never been in trouble in his life, stepped into the aisle, his expression one of cold, righteous anger. "This has gone far enough. This is insane," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You have to let us get him help before it's too late." Mr. Rogers rounded on him, his eyes blazing. "Are you prepared to lose your full-ride football scholarship, Josh? If not, I strongly suggest you return to your seat and remain silent." Each agonizing rotation of the prosthetic sent a fresh jolt of agony through my entire nervous system. The cloying smell of burning plastic, now mingled with the coppery scent of my own blood, was making me nauseous. "For God's sake, just rip it off of him," someone yelled from the corner. If only it were that simple. This wasn't a glove. The titanium post was a part of my skeleton, surgically implanted and drilled directly into the marrow of my ulna after a grueling series of procedures that had taken the better part of a year. It was fused to me. Near the windows, Katie was openly weeping, pounding her fists against the thick glass, trying to get the attention of anyone who might be passing in the hallway. "Help! Somebody, please, you have to help us. He's dying in here." Mr. Rogers, deaf to the chaos and the pleas, turned his full, terrifying attention back to me. He strode over to my desk, his face a mask of grim, misguided determination. "This ridiculous, attention-seeking performance will end right now," he announced. He was reaching for my arm, the one thing that couldn't happen. "Don't touch it," I screamed, the sound tearing from my lungs, raw and desperate. "Mr. Rogers, no." A dozen voices shouted at once, a last futile attempt to reason with the unreasonable. But he was lost to logic. He seized my prosthetic wrist with both of his hands, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. "I have had quite enough of your theatrics and your conveniently timed emergencies," he snarled. And then, with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he yanked. The sound that ripped through the room was not one of pain, but of butchery. It was a wet, sickening, tearing sound that will be seared into my memory until the day I die. He hadn't just removed a prosthetic. He had ripped the metal implant from the bone, tearing out chunks of muscle, severing nerves, and shredding connective tissue. A fine mist of blood erupted from the wound, atomizing in the air and spattering across the desks and faces of the students nearest to me. The world tilted violently, and I crashed to the floor, the impact sending a shockwave through my entire body. My one remaining hand instinctively flew to the mangled, bleeding stump of my arm. The room descended into pure, primal pandemonium. Screams echoed off the walls. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" "Nobody move," Mr. Rogers stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. He was backing away, his eyes wide with dawning horror. He was still holding my prosthetic, which was now dripping with my blood and festooned with ragged pieces of my own flesh. His face was the color of chalk. "The state testing protocol, it says," he mumbled, his mind still clinging to the wreckage of his precious rules. Willie was now hurling his entire body against the locked classroom door, again and again. "It's locked. Why in God's name is it locked?" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "It's the automatic locks," someone else cried out. "They engage during testing. Nobody can leave for another 13 minutes. Josh and 3 of his teammates, their faces set in grim masks, began to advance on the teacher. "Give us the keys," Josh said, his voice low and dangerous. "Right now. Stay back," Mr. Rogers shrieked, his composure completely disintegrating. "You'll all be expelled. Your futures are over." My vision was collapsing, the edges of the world turning fuzzy and black. The pain was a living thing, a monstrous entity that was consuming me from the inside out. Through the encroaching darkness, I felt a series of gentle slaps against my cheek. "Stay with me. You have to keep your eyes open." Destiny was pleading, her voice thick with tears. "Don't you dare close your eyes." The pounding on the door grew more frantic, a desperate, chaotic rhythm from both sides. With a roar of pure rage, someone lifted a desk chair high above their head. "Don't you dare damage school property," Mr. Rogers began to screech, but his words were obliterated by the explosive sound of the window shattering into a million glittering shards. A moment later, the classroom door flew open with such force that it slammed against the wall. The school janitor stood in the doorway, a ring of master keys in his hand, his eyes wide with disbelief as he surveyed the scene of carnage. "What in the holy hell?" he breathed. "Call 911 now," was the unified, hysterical scream that answered him. My journey back to the world was a series of grueling, painful steps. The first surgery was an emergency procedure to save my life, to stanch the catastrophic blood loss. The second was a marathon session of reconstructive work, as surgeons tried to repair the ravaged bone and tissue. The third was a preparatory surgery, reshaping the mangled stump for the distant, uncertain possibility of a new prosthetic. The doctors later told my parents I had lost nearly half of my body's blood volume. A few more minutes, and the story would have ended there. The police found Mr. Rogers in the school parking lot, wandering in a daze, still clutching my bloody prosthetic. In a decision that beggared belief, the state testing board placed him on paid administrative leave. But that wasn't justice. It was an insult. He had torn a part of my body away, and now I was resolved to systematically dismantle his entire life. The first coherent thought that broke through the morphine haze was the memory of that sound, the gruesome, wet, tearing noise of metal being ripped from bone. My eyes snapped open to the harsh glare of hospital lights and the insistent, rhythmic beeping of a half-dozen monitors. The nurse who was checking my foot jumped back with a startled cry as I began to thrash in the bed. She gently but firmly held my shoulders. "You're safe now. You're in the ICU," she repeated, her voice a soothing balm on my frayed nerves. My throat was a desert, and when I tried to form words, only a dry, rasping sound emerged. She spooned ice chips into my mouth, and, as they melted, she explained that I'd been unconscious for 2 full days, a time filled with 3 separate surgeries. "You've been screaming in your sleep," she said softly, her eyes filled with a deep, professional compassion as she adjusted my morphine drip. My parents were crumpled in chairs near the window, looking like they had aged a decade in 2 days. My mother's eyes were red and raw, and a fresh wave of tears came when she saw I was awake. My father's hands trembled as he approached the bed. They had been there through it all, listening to every muffled, nightmare-fueled scream that had echoed from my room. That afternoon, a detective came to my bedside. He was a stark, sober presence in the sterile, white room. While I was still drifting on a sea of painkillers, he took out a small notebook, clicked his pen, and asked me to tell him what had happened. The words came slowly, slurred by the medication, but I pieced together the entire horrific sequence of events. The malfunctioning prosthetic, the escalating pain, the smoke, and Mr. Rogers' chilling, inhuman adherence to protocol. He documented every detail, his expression growing darker and more grim as I described being trapped behind locked doors for 13 agonizing minutes while I bled onto the classroom floor. "We have the prosthetic as evidence," he said, showing me a photo on his phone that made my stomach churn. My own tissue, ragged and bloody, was still clinging to the metal fingers. The next morning, a representative from the school district paid me a visit. She was a woman in a crisp business suit who stood at the foot of my bed and refused to make eye contact. She read, in a flat, dispassionate voice, from a series of prepared index cards, babbling about their thorough and ongoing investigation and their deep commitment to student safety. Her eyes flitted around the room, landing anywhere but on the thick, white bandages that encased what was left of my arm. She droned on and on about policies and procedures while I focused on the slow, steady drip of the fore fluid, counting the seconds until she would leave. "Get out." I finally managed to croak, the two words scraping my raw throat. She nearly ran from the room. Destiny came to see me on the third day. She looked haunted, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Her hands were shaking, and she started crying the moment she sat down. "I should have done more," she whispered, the words choked with guilt. "I should have tackled him or something. I just stood there." She recounted the terror of watching me lose consciousness, of being utterly convinced that she was watching me die. I tried to tell her that she had saved me, that her voice and her frantic actions had kept me anchored to the world when I was slipping away. But she just shook her head, inconsolable. My phone, which my parents had finally retrieved for me, began to buzz with a relentless, maddening intensity. A video of the incident, shot on a student's phone, had gone viral. It was short and grainy, but the audio was terrifyingly clear, the screams, the pounding, the shattering glass. The internet had erupted. The comment sections of news articles and social media posts were a raging fire of public outrage, with thousands of people calling for Mr. Rogers to be fired and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Each notification was a tiny, percussive shock to my already overloaded system. Later that day, the hospital's financial counselor appeared at my door, a thick binder of paperwork tucked under her arm. In a calm, practiced tone, she laid out the staggering costs I was facing. A new prosthetic, she explained, would be at least $40,000, a figure that didn't include the astronomical cost of the months or even years of physical therapy I would need. Our insurance company, she added, was currently investigating the nature of the incident to determine liability and coverage, a process that could take up to 6 months. I felt a surge of helpless rage. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but my one good hand was tethered by a foreline. She left a mountain of forms on my bedside table, a stark, bureaucratic testament to the fact that even my dismemberment had a price tag. My first session with a physical therapist was a brutal and humbling experience. Just sitting up in bed without toppling over was now a Herculean task. The sudden and dramatic loss of weight on one side of my body had completely destroyed my sense of balance. The therapist was kind and patient, but every movement, no matter how small, sent lances of fire through the traumatized nerves in my shoulder. She helped me stand for 10 agonizing seconds before my legs gave out from under me, and I collapsed back onto the bed, gasping for air. "We'll take it one day at a time," she said, her voice gentle. "It might be 6 months before we can even start talking about a new prosthetic." The nightmares were relentless. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that room. The door was always slamming shut, the lock clicking with a deafening finality. And Mr. Rogers was always there, always reaching for me. I would wake up to the shrill alarm of my heart monitor, drenched in a cold sweat, a searing phantom pain burning in an empty space where my arm used to be. A nurse would rush in and administer a dose of anti-anxiety medication that would mercifully blur the sharp edges of my terror. When I finally worked up the courage to look at my phone again, the messages from my classmates painted a stark picture of a school divided. Half were messages of support, prayers, and horrified disbelief. The other half were filled with poison, accusing me of faking the whole thing, of intentionally damaging my own expensive prosthetic just to get out of test. One anonymous account had sent me a long, rambling message detailing how convenient the timing of the malfunction had been. I held my thumb over the reply button, my mind filled with 1,000 angry retorts. Instead, I methodically deleted every single social media app from my phone. My dad came to see me that evening, his face a grim, stony mask. "They arrested Rogers," he said, his voice low and strained. "In the school parking lot. You still had your prosthetic with your tissue still on it." He had to stop and take a deep, shuddering breath. Then he delivered the final, infuriating blow. The state testing board had placed Mr. Rogers on paid administrative leave. "Paid leave," he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "He rips your arm off, and they give him a paid vacation." 10 minutes later, my mom burst in, her phone in hand, already scrolling through the websites of top personal injury attorneys. She was adamant that we needed legal representation immediately. I tried to argue, to tell them that I had my own plans for justice, that lawyers would just get in the way. My mom grabbed my hand. "You're in shock," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "You're not thinking clearly." But I had never been more clear-headed in my life. The legal system was slow and methodical. My desire for retribution was immediate and all-consuming. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Willie, containing a single, haunting photo of the testing room. My desk was still there, the jagged crack in the wood a permanent scar. And on the floor were the dark, indelible stains of my own blood. I saved the photo to a new folder on my phone. I named it Evidence. And then I began to compile a list of every student who had been in that room, every single witness to Mr. Rogers' monstrous act. The hospital social worker provided me with a stack of literature about my rights as a victim and the school's clear violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I feigned interest, but my mind was already racing ahead. I had already found Mr. Rogers' home address through a simple search of public property records. The next morning, I called the ADA complaint hotline from my hospital bed. I recounted the entire story to the woman on the other end of the line, my voice shaking with rage as I described being trapped and bleeding while a teacher obsessed over protocol. She was audibly horrified, promising an immediate and high-priority investigation. Later, Josh texted. The school administration was already spinning the narrative, insisting that the locked doors were a non-negotiable state requirement. He had been asking tough questions, and the assistant principal had twice warned him about his attitude and its potential impact on his college prospects. I told him to keep pushing, to record everything. My parents, acting without my knowledge, had hired a formidable civil attorney named Amina Farouk. She arrived at the hospital like a force of nature, firing off questions and taking notes on a tablet. Within hours, she had filed a sweeping set of FOIA requests, demanding a decade's worth of documents from the school district. I realized then that her legal machinations and my own quest for vengeance might not be mutually exclusive. An anonymous student sent me a second, longer video of the incident. The audio was chillingly clear. You could hear Mr. Rogers' cold declaration of state testing protocol, the sickening sound of my arm being torn from my body, my own inhuman scream, and his subsequent panic command for everyone to stay put. I forwarded it to Amina. "This is it," she said, her voice grim. "This is willful disregard for human safety." He made a choice. Diego Alvarez, the CEO of the company that manufactured my prosthetic, called to express his horror and offer his assistance. He mentioned the possibility of a replacement, a rare glimmer of hope in a very dark time. But that hope was quickly dashed by a letter from my insurance company, informing me that all coverage was on hold pending a 6-month investigation into pre-existing device failure. I punched the wall in a fit of rage. A local reporter, Son Adebayo, convinced me to go on camera. I told him everything, holding nothing back. The story aired that night, and the public outcry was deafening. The superintendent, Dr. Yara Haddad, demanded a meeting. She arrived with 2 lawyers and an offer, a $50,000 education grant, in exchange for my silence and the withdrawal of my ADA complaint. Amina, who had arrived just in time, laughed in their faces. I told them I didn't want their money. I wanted policy changes. I wanted accountability. I wanted Mr. Rogers' career to be over permanently. They left, pale and shaken. The school then tried to retaliate, writing up Destiny for leaving her seat and threatening Josh's scholarship. But the tide was turning. Amina's FOIA requests yielded a treasure trove of damning evidence. A district policy that explicitly forbade overrides for medical emergencies, and a history of previous complaints against Mr. Rogers for similar behavior. We gave all to the press. The story exploded. The janitor came forward with information about a 5-minute security delay on the master keys. 5 minutes that had almost cost me my life. My parents' private investigator discovered a pattern of behavior from Mr. Rogers, two other incidents at previous schools that had been quietly settled and covered up. The trauma was taking its toll. A chance encounter with a noisy toy in a grocery store sent me into a full-blown panic attack, leaving me sobbing in a puddle of spilled milk. I started having violent, vengeful fantasies, which led to therapy with a trauma specialist named Dr. Priya Nair. The civil deposition was brutal, with the opposing counsel accusing me of faking my injury. The school and the teachers' union circled the wagons, blaming the prosthetics company. Then came a complication. Diego's lab found evidence of water damage in the prosthetic, the result of a spilled drink weeks earlier. It was the opening Mr. Rogers' lawyer had been waiting for. But we kept fighting. Josh organized a student walkout that drew hundreds of supporters and widespread media attention. The district was forced to act. The prosecutor, armed with our evidence, added a charge of willful disregard for safety. The district's lawyers, terrified of a jury trial, offered a settlement. Not just a monetary sum, but all of the policy changes I had demanded. I accepted. In a packed and emotional school board meeting, the autolock policy was unanimously overturned. In a quiet courtroom, Mr. Rogers pleaded guilty to all charges. He lost his teaching license forever. The healing process was long and arduous. I was fitted for a new, more advanced prosthetic. The nightmares slowly began to recede. I told my story at a school safety forum, and the district implemented a raft of new safety measures. 6 months after the incident, I woke up one morning and realized I'd slept through the night. The first thing I thought about wasn't revenge, or the pain, or the testing room. It was waffles. I was finally, after so much darkness, starting to feel like myself again.